All right, so in this video, I'm going to share some ideas and opinions and views that will probably upset many people and ruffle some feathers. And I can already kind of anticipate many of the negative comments that will be probably quite hateful and will more or less be attacks on my character or more or less be examples of people misunderstanding what I'm saying and taking it as a personal attack and then therefore attacking me personally. All that being said, that's fine. I stand behind everything that I'm saying, and it's something that I've arrived at to be quite true, quite accurate. Maybe uncomfortable, maybe annoying, maybe unpleasant, but quite true and quite accurate. And as far as I can tell, these days trauma is a word and a concept, like many words and concepts in modern times, that have really lost their meaning and really lost their weight. And as we unpack this, I'm going to give examples to clearly illustrate what I'm talking about, and I'm also going to show basically what I think the term actually means, and then kind of more so how it's commonly and more so misunderstood. What I've noticed, it seems to more and more be becoming a colloquial term for anything that registers as slightly negative or slightly uncomfortable, or a situation or event that unfolded not to our preference. And I've noticed it's really like a social badge of honor these days for people to talk about, how hard their childhood was, or at least how much they perceive it as being hard, and then how much better things could have been, basically because they've microanalyzed, divided, subdivided, and categorized themselves and others into all these ridiculous kind of ideas. And I think the reason why a lot of people buy into this and have these kinds of ideas is because the underlying assumption they have about reality is kind of like, oh, it should be self-serving and it should be for my benefit and it should be for my highest good and my greatest pleasure and my greatest joy and my greatest reward and fulfilling my highest purpose, my fullest potential, and being my truest, most authentic, harmonious, perfect self. Which basically, if you buy into those ideas, it's absolutely 110% a excellent recipe for being miserable, for being unhappy, for being unsatisfied, and for never actually achieving any of the things that you're setting out to be. Really, what was a turning point for me and what helped me really understand this is just, I can remember an explicit conversation I'd had that was pretty identical to dozens of other ones that I had, where someone's telling me about, all the trauma and how their childhood wasn't good, and they have this trauma and they're working through this and they're processing that and they're going through this and they're working on this. They're just explaining to me all this stuff. But then I look at them and I'm like, well, they have the ability to hold down a relationship. And in this instance, the person had been married for quite a long time, fairly happily, nothing, no issue there. I'm like, okay, they can hold down a relationship, no problem. Okay, they can hold down a job because this person had a job for a really long time. Okay, no problem there. They're not addicted to drugs or alcohol. They're able to easily and fully sleep through the night. They're more or less having normal digestion. They're not committing crime. They're not violent, and they're not overly harming the people around them, either physically or emotionally or whatever. So I'm like, well, I'm not really seeing the trauma. Like, based on what the term used to mean, which I'll get to in a second, like, I'm not really seeing what is really holding you back, other than you just maybe being lazy or being dumb or dull or creating this convoluted, complicated, confused state for yourself that you constantly feel disappointed or not good enough or whatever. But you're creating that for yourself. It has nothing to do with this word you're using that you're trying to put off on the situation. And I'm thinking, like, because the thing is, I know plenty of people who have experienced legitimate trauma and they can't hold down relationships. They can't really hold down jobs. They struggle with substance abuse things. They really have trouble sleeping through the night. Their digestion is pretty whacked up. Maybe they've committed crimes. Maybe they've been violent. Maybe their life is like really quite unstable. And I'm thinking, like, well, wait, I thought that's what trauma meant, because I can fairly see that they experienced something that completely jacked up their nervous system, their sense of self, and it just keeps them stuck in this pretty horrible way of living. So in many ways, I kind of take personal offense, and I think it's kind of annoying and really rude and disservice and arrogant and narcissistic and self-congratulatory that people who have not experienced things that are genuinely horrible, violence, being taken away from their parents, or their parents dying, or being sexually abused as a kid, or growing up in poverty with drug addicted parents. Like, so many things that I personally know people that have experienced horrible things, even worse that I just listed. And they're not out being like, oh, my trauma this, my trauma that, I'm working on this, I'm fulfilling my highest good. They're not really doing all this stuff because they struggle with basic facets of life: holding out a relationship, holding out a job, substance abuse, violent crime, crime in general, terrible digestion, just like real legitimate problems that I thought that that's what the terms actually meant and referred to. So then I encountered tons of people, because where I've lived, there's so many people that are completely bought into this, and I've encountered so many people that don't have any of those problems. They never have, and they probably never will, and their life is relatively stable and fine, but they're just creating all this problem and all these complications for themselves. It's like, what is the deal? So basically, getting to shift gears now. And so what does trauma actually mean? That I'm talking about examples. Well, the best illustration that I can give is that it's kind of like a record skipping or a CD skipping, and just getting stuck on that same thing on repeat, on loop, which just over time eradicates your nervous system and has a pretty profound destabilizing quality that really wears kind of the nervous system raw over time, which is like causes a variety of reactions and compensation patterns, which is what I was talking about earlier. Can't hold down a relationship, can't hold down a job, substance abuse problems, violence, crime, terrible digestion, like inability to sleep, inability to rest, all these types of things. And I don't mean just because people are neurotic or drink a bunch of caffeine, but I just mean like literally they can't. And I mean, if you want to look at great examples, think about like people that suffered through war and like experienced some of the worst things that humans can do to each other. It's a great example to see exactly what I'm talking about, which is not the same as the examples that I'll give in a little bit that I've overheard legitimately many times over in real life, either talking to people or out at a restaurant. And I could sit here for hours and give you example after example after example, and basically they all are kind of variations on the same theme. So yeah, basically, if you can just imagine you're trying to live your life and all of a sudden, oh, the CD skips, and maybe your reaction is drugs or violence or anger or some crazy thing that has a pretty negative effect on the people around you and your life and your relationships. That's kind of the best way I can describe what trauma really is, and the way I think the term used to be used. So let me give you some examples of real things that I've genuinely heard people say with complete sincerity and complete honesty. And this will really kind of encapsulate and circle back with so many of the things that I've said in this video. The first, the first example I heard for real at a restaurant, and I almost spit out my food and fucking left the restaurant because I was just like, all right, man, this is the last straw. Like I'm done with this city. I got to get out of here. This is just the pinnacle of ridiculousness. So there was a lady and her friend that were at dinner, or it was lunch actually, and she was talking about how she was the best athlete in her school and won pretty much everything she did, and was like basically the best, super popular, and you know, her parents were super supportive. They loved her. She had a great family, all these things. And she was saying how traumatic that was. I'm like I was sitting there eating and the person's behind me and I was just like, what? I'm like, wait. I'm like, this is because I'd kind of already had some of these ideas from some of the other experiences and conversations that I had. I heard this and I was like, this is the perfect illustration for exactly what I'm talking about. And I'm just like, wait, all these things that most people would just do anything to have: great family, being the best athlete, winning a bunch of things, like having a great life. And I'm like, now we're at the point to where that's traumatic. And like, not only did she think that, but she went on this whole thing about her therapist validated it. And all these practitioners in her life validated it and told her like, oh yeah, you're right, that's so traumatic. I'm like, wait, so is Michael Jordan traumatized? Like, is not Kobe Bryant, rest in peace. But like, I don't know, was he traumatized when he was the best? And LeBron James, like, we just go down through the list of things of people that have excelled and achieved what people dream and wish for. That's a trauma. I was like, okay, if that's the reality, I'm out of here. Um, so that's the first one. The second one was just again a real thing. This lady was talking about how she was traumatized because she moved into a new house with her husband and kids. Her husband had a great job, great money, great situation, and her house was so big that she wasn't used to the space, so it was traumatic for her. I'm not even going to comment on that one. I'm just going to let it stand alone. So the third story is another one that is absolutely real. Uh, that I heard a lady who was talking about how traumatized she was because her husband left her after he found out that she had been lying to him and cheating on him for over a year. And then, of course, she was talking about how her therapist was supporting it and how her husband should have handled it better and he could have been more mature in how he processed it and they could have handled it and processed it together and done couple stuff. And it was just, he wasn't up to the task and he wasn't willing to do the work because he just didn't feel like he could trust her anymore and he wanted to leave the situation. This is real shit that a therapist was telling her. And I'm like, okay. And this next example actually gets quite a lot better. And this is a lady who was traumatized because her husband was angry and didn't trust her anymore and was kind of like a little bit controlling of her behavior and always wanted to know where she was and where she was going because he found out that she had lied to him and been cheating on him with a coworker of hers for like years while they were actively trying to conceive a child together. And again, she had all the validation and support from her therapist. He could have handled it better. He should have handled it better. He didn't want to do the work. He shouldn't be controlling. He shouldn't be so mistrusting. And I'm like, what world are you people living in where doing terrible things to people and then those people reacting in a normal way, being like, that's not okay? It just illustrates everything I've been saying to a perfect, exact T. And the real tragedy of the situation is that people don't realize that. Like, that is not explicitly obvious. So I'll give you the last example, which I also heard. This was from the same conversation from the lady who was, the best athlete in her school and very popular, and her parents were supportive, and that was traumatic. Her friend was basically talking about how traumatic it was for him when he got laid off from his like super cushy, easy tech job where he made six figures and had tons of PTO, tons of benefits, and he got a six-figure severance package plus insurance and everything else for a period of time. And he talked about how traumatic that was. So basically, to wrap it all up, these people are saying that their experiences are the same as someone who was, I don't know, repeatedly molested or raped as a child, or someone that went to war and saw the worst things that humans can do to each other, someone that grew up in poverty with drug addicted parents, or someone that a baby was taken away from their parents at birth or whatever. Like, so many different examples of things that are legitimately terrible. Like, I don't know, people living in war zones, people living in Afghanistan or Syria or Ukraine at the moment, or any other place in history where people survived genuine hardship. So what these people were saying is this lady being the best athlete in her school, having loving parents and supporting family, and that it's the same as these other things. It's a trauma, just the same. And then you have a bunch of people, therapists, validating that. Which I'm like, if you like, if that's not the biggest Brave New World 1984 kind of example, then I really don't know what is, and I'm not sure exactly what to tell people or what to even say past that point. What I'm saying here is that many of the people that buy into this, and a lot of the reason why the term has become such a generic kind of colloquial term, is because people have bought into an extremely convoluted, complicated, and confused way of understanding the world. A way of viewing the world that excels in mental gymnastics but lacks any meaningful degree of pragmatism and meaningful degree of solution and really meaningful degree of like actual connection to how life works and what's generally going on here and what has gone on here for a while. It's basically a way for people to construct a worldview in which they're constantly a victim. They're constantly a victim of their emotions, a victim of situations, a victim of systemic structures, a victim of everything in the world, simultaneously because they think the world should be serving them and should be for their highest good and should be for whatever their personal whim or flight of fancy might be. And basically, I think in this instance, a lot of the problems that people experience are self created. And ultimately, there is no solution since the deeper you go in, the more issues you find, and the more work that needs to be done, and the more healing that needs to happen. And it just becomes a self fulfilling prophecy where the more you know, the more you realize, oh, I have so much more to do, and there's always more. And it's kind of just like a hamster on a wheel, just chasing a piece of cheese or something. And basically, people invest or invent these exaggerated expectations and kind of idealistic fantasies that people should live up to, so they're constantly disappointed, constantly feel not good enough. And more importantly, they always have the upper hand in an emotional relationship or an emotional situation because they always have their kind of like trauma card to pull out, or they're like doing the work trump card, or they can denigrate and put down someone else because they're not doing the work. They're not living their highest authenticity, or not living their highest truth, or they're not buying. They're basically putting down someone else because they're not buying into the same kind of mental tension and anxiety and mental gymnastics that they are. So I think that's the most important kind of self-serving aspect, is it always gives them the kind of the upper hand.